In Rwanda, they had what was called hate radio. And it was about having one ethnic group commit genocide over another one. And when we went into Burundi, our intention was countering hate radio, not with love radio, but with what we called common ground radio, which was to bring together people from the two sides and have them see ways of having peaceful coexistence, of overcoming their differences, and the like. At one point, we did a survey and we found about 90% of the country was listening to it. That was extraordinary. You couldn't get that kind of audience almost anywhere else in the world.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. My guest today is John Marks, founder of Search for Common Ground, an international NGO whose purpose is to end violent conflict around the world. In 2018, Search was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. Over the years, some of their notable work has included helping to avert genocide in Burundi, supporting free elections in Liberia and Sierra Leone, and creating training in the Democratic Republic of Congo to curb sexual assault, among many other initiatives. Marks is the author of a new book, From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. Together we spoke about how Esalen helped to launch his work, and what he's learned in over 40 years of Track 2, or citizen diplomacy. John Marks, thank you so much for joining us today on Voices of Esalen.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've been coming to Esalen for 40 years, so this is the first time I've ever come by podcast.
John, your book is From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. We're going to get into social entrepreneurship, but first I want to begin with the fact that in the 1970s, you were an investigative reporter. You wrote a book called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate about the CIA, LSD, and mind control. Why did you do this?
At that point, I was adversarial to my core. And I saw that there had been many abuses committed by the CIA. And so I started to delve into this particular subject. And it's what actually brought me to Esalen in the first place, because Michael Murphy sent Jim Hickman to see me, because in one of the notes, I noted that there had been a victim of the CIA's clandestine testing program who had been kept on LSD for, I think, 70 days straight. But Jim also told me that they were having conferences about relations with the Soviet Union with Esalen was running. They were running projects. And they wanted sort of background on or information or advice on how to deal with the intelligence agencies like the CIA and the KGB, which clearly would be interested in what was going on. But I got hooked by the work they were doing. And that, for me, was a real moment of transition.
Talk to me a little bit about the birth of your NGO, Search for Common Ground. When did it begin, and how in the world did you get such an ambitious project off the ground?
Well, it started in 1982, and it really came out of what I had seen at Esalen. The work that the Soviet American Exchange Group was doing was what I saw that I wanted to do. But I wanted more, let's just say I was a Washington person, Washington, D.C., and I wanted to combine the East Coast with the West Coast. I perceived that Esalen was the essence of the West Coast, and I wanted to make a sort of a synthesis of the two, of bring the working I had been doing in foreign policy to preventing nuclear war and to having better relations with the Soviets. And so I started this Search for Common Ground in 1982 with the notion that it was possible to transform the world away from being an adversarial win-lose place into being a non-adversarial win-win place, starting with U.S.-Soviet relations.
Would you mind drawing us a picture of the geopolitical kind of schema at that time with regards to the United States and Soviet Union? Had there begun glasnost, or was it extremely adversarial in 82, 83?
It was pre-glasnost. It was still a hard time. I don't know if you know about this, but Esalen got into it after the Olympics were canceled in 1980, when the relations were at a low point and all the, if you will, established organizations that had been doing work with the Soviets, for the most part, pulled out. Esalen which had started at exchanges on human potential, suddenly was almost the only game in town. They started doing what you might call more establishment kind of exchanges with the Soviet Union. And that's when I was there for the first conference that they ever had on U.S.-Soviet relations in the big house, now called the Murphy House. Esalen became the center, if not a center, not the center, perhaps, of exchanges with the Soviets for the next dozen years or so.
What were your initial projects with Search for Common Ground relating to U.S.-Soviet relations? I mean, during this time, you described that a lot of people were very interested in arms limitation.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't too interested in arms limitations. That was where conventional wisdom was trying to get better relations going. And I wish them good luck. But I figured you needed to be at least 6 months or a year ahead of conventional wisdom. The project that put my organization on the map was we formed a U.S.-Soviet task force to prevent terrorism. Terrorism at that time was a backwater issue. It wasn't forefront as it became after 9/11. And what we did is we got prominent Soviets and Americans talking to each other on the subject. And my whole assumption was if you could find an area where both sides had a common interest, you could perhaps find ways for them to work together. And there were things that they just couldn't have worked together on. But terrorism turned out to be one. I had meetings with very good facilitation. And I didn't know it at the time, but my Soviet co-leader was actually related by marriage to the head of the KGB. That made it possible for us to get the participation of two retired KGB generals, very high-level people, who actually came with them. This meeting was held in Santa Monica, not at Esalen. I took them for a walk on the Venice boardwalk on a Sunday, which they found absolutely like a zoo. And then we took them to Disneyland to show that there were, I guess, a more conventional side of America. One of the KGB generals, no luggage arrived, which people felt that was probably the good work of the CIA or the FBI. And we took him to the Sears in downtown Santa Monica to buy him new clothes and toilet goods and stuff. And it was a great success. And Ted Koppel and Nightline did a big exercise on it. And we worked out some ways to exchange information. So instead of what you might call the softer side of exchanges with the Soviets, which were perfectly wonderful. I mean, Esalen took Billy Joel to the Soviet Union, for example, and there were singers and back. We did one of the harder ones, which was to exchange on terrorism, and that turned into an official exchange, which exists to this day.
I'm curious about how this work that you did, Track 2 work with citizens and NGOs, how was it approved by the Track 1? By, for instance, if you're bringing former KGB officials to United States, how does the United States government or the CIA allow for this and not squash you?
Well, what happened was in the beginning, they tried to squash it. When I went in, I didn't want to act in an adversarial way to my own government. So I was talking to the State Department, and the very high official told me not to do it, to stop. And one of my participants was a colonel from West Point, and he got called in by the vice chief of staff of the Army, a 4-star general. He wasn't exactly commanded not to go, but it was very strongly implied that he shouldn't, and to his credit, he went anyway. But so the government was not in favor of this when we started. But as glasnost and perestroika raised their heads in the Soviet Union, relations got better and better. And by the time we actually got the project started, the State Department was telling, please keep us informed, and got to be very positive. And luckily, the official who had tried to stop me was transferred to another post. I didn't like him at all.
Was there any indication that Reagan was going to go in the direction of embracing the Soviets?
Well, he actually seemed to be a leader of that, but really the leader is President of the United States. And when Gorbachev started to transform the Soviet Union, the US government got more and more enthusiastic. In the beginning, they thought it was a fake and communist propaganda, but Gorbachev kept repeating it. That was his secret. He would give speech after speech talking about the need for glasnost, the need for a new way of thinking about things. And Esalen was right there at the center of providing information on how you had new thinking. They had very little influence on the United States, but a huge amount of influence on the Soviets. If you want people to accept a new reality and a new way of thinking, which we're trying to do, you need to give them a picture of what the new reality can look like. And storytelling was the best way of doing it. I mean, nobody reads learned monographs, as far as I can tell. And even books, which I like to write, are not the best way to communicate. Graphic imagery, television, radio. It's why by the time I stepped down as the head of search, about 50% of our budget was going to making television programming around the world. And I felt that that was a key to transformation at a mass level. I found that when I got started, we were doing workshops and trainings, and maybe we had 30 people in a room, 40 people, and you couldn't change the world with 30 or 40 people only in the room. You could have influential people who could change other people, but it was too hard a slog. Whereas when we started making TV series, we would have like millions of people watching. Now, if only 10% had a behavior change, that would be a behavior change of 100,000 people.
I wanted to talk about some of the media that you produced, because we've definitely seen that media can stoke sectarian violence, as evidenced by the Hutu-led radio stations in Rwanda. And I wanted you to talk about, for example, the radio station that you established in Burundi.
Well, in Rwanda, they had what was called hate radio. And it was about having one ethnic group commit genocide over another one. And when we went into Burundi, our intention was countering hate radio, not with love radio, but with what we called common ground radio, which was to bring together people from the two sides and have them see ways of having peaceful coexistence, of overcoming their differences and the like. We did radio soap opera that had, I think, about 700 episodes altogether. It was about a Hutu family and a Tutsi family that lived next door to each other, and they had problems and their kids had problems. And at the end of every half-hour episode, they would solve their problems, only to get back into it the next week. It came on twice a week, and it was hugely popular. At one point, we did a survey, and we found about 90% of the country was listening to it. That was extraordinary. You couldn't get that kind of audience anywhere, almost anywhere else in the world. We graduated to television. Our main format was called The Team, and it was in every country where we produced it, and we did it in 18 countries. It was about a soccer team that the world calls football. And on that team were players who represented the diversity of the country. So in Kenya, everybody was from a different tribe. In Morocco, it was people from the countryside and people from the city. And in Congo, it was all girls, and the problem was sexual violence. We used that to tell stories. It wasn't really about soccer or football. It was about the team and the members and the problems they've received and their families had. And once you had the premise in place, it was good soap opera.
Did you also create television programming in the Middle East?
I did quite a few. In Palestine, we did a reality series, 2 seasons of it actually, which was called The President. And Palestine hasn't had any elections in about 20 years. And this was a reality series along the lines of American Idol, where young people campaigned to be the next president of Palestine. And then we had SMS voting on who won. And it was so popular that the actual president, brought the winner into his entourage and praised the show. I don't think he believed a word of it, but it showed that new blood was possible, perhaps.
You all created a U.S. Soviet task force in the Middle East right around the time the Gulf War began.
That's right.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the geopolitics of that moment?
Okay. Our U.S. Soviet task force on terrorism has been quite successful. The idea that the U.S. Americans and Soviets could cooperate for the common good was something that was working, and we thought it could be extended to other countries, other places, other subjects. And so we tried and we organized a meeting of about a dozen Americans and Soviets on Lebanon, which was in the middle of a civil war at that point. And that turned out not to be right. But what it led to, because we learned, or we realized that the Middle East, you couldn't separate Lebanon from the rest of the Middle East. It was too interconnected. So we changed the program from a U.S. Soviet task force on Lebanon to one on the Middle East. And then as the Soviets were going down and Russia replaced them, the having the Russians involved didn't make a lot of sense. And out of that evolved our whole Middle East program, which we used to bring together Israelis, Iranians, Arabs, and Turks. And that went on for the next dozen years, quite successful as a program, but it didn't prevent the current conflict. And that's one of my tragedies. We were always looking for areas where there could have agreements. We put together something called the Middle East Consortium for Infectious Disease Surveillance. And the idea was to bring together doctors and public health specialists from Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. That still exists to this day. It's been going about 20 years. By having it unofficial and not in the government. In the Middle East, when things are official, they get broken off whenever there's a crisis. And you can almost count on there's going to be a crisis there, every year or so, every couple of years. And it kept going, and it turned into what I would call a track one official project. And the only unofficial people at the end of it were us, the facilitators. But the official people didn't want it to become official because then they would have probably lost it.
And you also created a news wire service at that time?
That's right. That went on for about 6 or 7 years. Every week we put out, I guess, 4 or 5 articles about a new kind of Middle East, a peaceful Middle East. And I believe we had about 30 to 40,000 reprints of those articles. We offered them free. We called it a news service, and we offered it free to every newspaper in the world. So everybody from the Herald Tribune in Paris to the regional newspapers in the Middle East carried our stuff. It was one of our better projects, which unfortunately we dropped because of lack of funding finally.
Was there fear from your organization or from the United States organization that you use the phrase useful idiot in your book a couple of times? Was there fear that you would be used by enemy intelligence agencies?
I think there was a fear. Absolutely. Particularly in the U.S. Soviet days. That ended pretty much after the Soviet Union went down, and nobody brought it up. But when the terrorism project I described earlier, the counterterrorism project, we were accused of being useful idiots by the State Department. I mean, not formally, not by the spokesman, but let's just say that was in the air.
How do you respond to that anyway? How do you assure people that that you're not a mark?
Look, I'm a common grounder. I have an Aikido approach to things. Instead of confronting it directly, I accept it and try to divert the energy. I learned my Aikido from George Leonard and Terry Dobson at Esalen, by the way.
Yeah, George Leonard, it seems that he's almost most famous for his Aikido within the kind of mythology of Esalen.
Yeah, I wasn't interested in being thrown on the mat. George took me to his dojo in Mill Valley at one point, and I hated it. I'm 6'3", and it just didn't suit me, though he was even taller than I was. But I practiced what you might call spiritual or political Aikido.
And how would you define that, John?
In boxing, if an opponent comes at you, you try to reverse their energy flow by 180 degrees and knock them back on their rear end. That's the essence of boxing. In Aikido, what you do is you accept their energy, blend with it, and try to divert it by 10 degrees or 15 degrees, just slightly. That was our a core operating principle. You couldn't usually find a grand unified solution to a particular conflict, but you could find usable, doable, feasible peace that you might be able to break off. I called it the salami slicing technique. That was how we operated. It's probably why we were pretty successful. I think Esalen was operating on that kind of basis also with the Soviets, but they may not have articulated it the same way.
I also like in your book, you kind of go through a value system, and one of the values you have is just the value of persistence. I mean, you've done and attempted to do some outrageous, nearly impossible things in your work. So can you talk to me a little bit about your stance on persistence?
The metaphor I love about persistence is the child's toy truck, which you wind up and it goes forward till it hits a piece of furniture. At that point, it doesn't try to knock over the piece of furniture. It backs up and finds another way around. And you need to be persistent if you're going to be a successful social entrepreneur. You probably need to be successful in life, but it's certainly important in social entrepreneurship. And that idea of keeping moving forward, but finding workarounds and ways to move forward in new paths or new things. And that's the essence of how you do the work that we do.
To extend this sports metaphor that we established with Aikido, can you tell me a little bit about how wrestling became a key diplomatic tool between the United States and Iran?
We at Search had organized high-level unofficial meetings between Iranian and American retired, so-called. The Iranians weren't very retired. It was really track 1.5. But we had those meetings, and they had come up because of good facilitation, it seemed to me, with a unified plan on how to solve the whole conflict. And the two sides went home, and neither the Iranian delegation or the Americans could sell it to their people back home. That's called the reentry problem. And it didn't work. And we went back to Sweden where we were holding the meetings, and people were a bit depressed. And a Iranian said, well, maybe it's time to shift our approach. Maybe it's time for Americans to return to Tehran openly, which hadn't happened for 10 years since the Iranian Revolution. And we thought that was a good idea and asked, how do we do that? And yeah, the Iranian professor said, any Americans who come are going to be heavily criticized. The ones who would be criticized the least are wrestlers. I hadn't thought of that one, but it seemed to me that it was a good idea because once we learned that wrestlers were the samurai, the saga tellers of Iran, and that wrestling was still the most popular sport with the masses. And so I went home and I got in touch with USA Wrestling, the America's National Wrestling Foundation, and they agreed to send a team. And suddenly I was on a plane to Iran, and I was there as an official on my visa. Not the kind of official, government official, but the kind who says 1, 2, 3 at a match, which I was not at all qualified for.
That's great. How did it go?
Well, it was hugely exciting. The world's press was there. It was an unprecedented thing. We were on every TV station and newspaper in the world. It was called, and this was the phrase we gave to it at the time, wrestling diplomacy, a takeoff on ping pong diplomacy, of course. And when we got back, President Clinton had the wrestlers and a group from Search to the White House to send a signal to the Iranians that he was interested in having better relations. And then the politicians messed it up. But we had teed it up. And that was what we were trying to do. We were trying to show that there could be an opening and through which there could really be better relations. And our program was very successful, but the patient died.
When you think about the various locales that you worked in, including the Middle East, Africa, Soviet Union, which arena did you feel you made the most ground in?
Well, the one I enjoyed the most was clearly the Middle East. That was the one I was most deeply engaged in. But if you look at the results and what's going on now, you could say that it wasn't a great success. I think the one where we were most successful was Central Africa, in Burundi and Congo, where in Congo we retrained over 100,000 members of the Congolese army in not being sexual predators. And you don't know how, when you're trying to talk about something not happening, like stopping rape, which was our intention, you don't know how many really you stop, but I think that probably tens of thousands of women were spared because of these efforts. We saw a great reaction to them. And in Burundi, I think we played a real role in preventing genocide, which they seemed to be on the brink of. And so those were some of the greatest successes.
I'm going to ask you a bit more about Africa. One of your peacemaking strategies was to empower women, for example, in Burundi.
You don't have to be a genius to notice that women are more likely to make peace than men. They don't have the ego in general. I mean, there are exceptions on both sides, but women don't have the ego problems, the need to save face, the need to get revenge, and the like. And we saw in Burundi particularly that women could lead the way. They were suffering because they were responsible for families. They were suffering the brunt of the war and the killing, but they weren't in the forefront of resolving it. And we wanted to empower them. And that was part of it. And we set up a women's center in Bujumbura, the capital. And by the time we were through, we had hundreds of local women associations we were working with, which combined Hutu and Tutsi women and were vehicles for social change. And it was one of our more successful programs.
You also describe having to become a weaver in order to successfully promote the peace in Burundi. Can you talk to me about what being a weaver is?
Well, it's combining things, not only doing one thing. In Burundi, we had the Women's Association, we had the radio studio that we were talking about previously. We were working with young militia members who were killers, who were doing most of the killing for political masters, and the common ground turned out to be both sides felt exploited by their leaders. We had a national drumming contest because drumming is so important in Burundi. Music, produced comic books, and we were trying to weave it all together to prevent conflict.
Yes.
And prevent violence. There was going to be conflict anyway, but we were just trying to prevent violence. And I think that part of the program was very successful. Burundi still has monumental programs, and we still work there. But let's just say genocide is off the table at this point.
You used participatory community theater in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Can you talk to me just a little bit about how you were able to use community theater to resolve conflict?
Okay. Well, one of my colleagues named Lena Slackmulder had got very interested in this, and she combined Brazilian street theater techniques with the reality, the context of being in the Congo. And by the time we were through, we had multiple theater troupes that would go into a village, find out what the local problems were, and put on a participatory play based on the local conflicts. And then our actors, after they got the crowd started, and you sometimes had thousands of people at these stuff. These are in areas that, let's say, didn't have a lot of entertainment. And they would bring people up to the audience to replace the actors that we brought in. And they were a very good way of doing local conflict resolution. And I believe our total audience was over 2 million people for this. It was being done on an industrial scale.
Yeah, it's just amazing the way that you as a peacemaker have become a media producer. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. It seems like you are guided by what works. You're a very pragmatic peacemaker. And it seems to me that you've landed on media as one of the most successful ways to promote peace.
Yeah, well, there was no other way to reach the masses, at least directly reach the masses. And I think I mentioned before that our working mantra was understand the differences and act on the commonalities. And we had about 30 different techniques on how to do that, one of which was media production. Soap opera for social change. You could be done within the theme of understanding differences, not saying there wasn't a conflict and trying to be Pollyannish about it, but showing how it could be resolved. And it was as good as the writers. If the drama was good, people watched. And it didn't matter that it was kind of conflict solving rather than conflict causing, which most of the media in this country is. There's a maxim in the news business: if it bleeds, it leads, and that was what we were trying to overcome. And it was easier to overcome internationally than in the United States because the media here is kind of set in its ways.
Yeah, you talk about showing movies in open fields on the back of an inflatable projection screen where thousands of people would gather.
Yeah. Well, that was what we were doing in the Congo, and I think we did it in a few other places too. It was called mobile cinemas, and you would set up in the middle of a field a video projector with a blow-up plastic screen. The word would go out. Sometimes we'd have 10,000 people there, and after we had movies were designed to prevent rape, if you will, to talk to victims. And rape in itself was a deep, dark secret in the DRC. A lot of wives would get thrown out of their house for being raped. In other words, they were considered to be damaged goods. And we were trying to get out of the closet, if you will, with that. And the mobile cinema caused people to come forward, and would have loudspeakers, and they would tell their stories, and they were cathartic experiences for a large audience. And again, we had audiences total in the millions.
It's wild. Yeah. I want to drop one more geographical locale and ask you about it. Would you mind talking about your efforts to diffuse extremism in Moroccan prisons?
Prisons tend to be the breeding ground of terrorists. It's true everywhere in the world. People are held in very bad conditions and the like. And we're not the only people. In Morocco, we worked in about 40 different prisons to show that there was an alternative way of dealing with conflict. We included guards because a lot of the conflict was with the guards, the prisoners and the guards. And we were trying to give prisoners a way of being that would allow them, when they got out, to be productive citizens, not to be violent. We worked with a Sufi Muslim group, which sort of made it Muslim correct, if you will. In other words, they would take premises of Islam, quotes from the Quran, which of course I had no my organization had any knowledge of whatsoever, and work that into the training. So it was culturally appropriate, Muslim appropriate, as well as including modern conflict resolution techniques. And that worked very well.
Let's go back to the Middle East. You lived in Jerusalem for 2 years. You're working to mend fences between Israelis and Palestinians there. Obviously, this is just one of the most intractable conflicts in the entire world. What was your investment there? Are you Jewish?
I am.
Was that part of the reason that you felt personally invested in Middle East?
That's why I stayed out of it for the first 10 years of the organization. I felt that I wasn't sure that I could do it. And it took me about 10 years of being a common grounder before I saw I could work in the region. And the opportunity arose. It's very dangerous if you try to mediate in your own divorce.
Yeah.
You don't want to be involved as a conflict resolution or a peacemaker when you have a strong emotional stake and you can't hold it and you can't deny it. And in every conflict, there's clearly one side is right and one side is wrong. And we all have our views on what that is and what that means. But it doesn't work if you try to advance the side that is right. That's kind of called human rights work, and it's a different field than being a peacemaker.
What years were you there, John?
We lived there 2002 to 2004 during the Second Intifada. Buses were blowing up in our neighborhood in Jerusalem. We lived about 70 meters from the dividing line between Israel and Palestine. And we would have lived on the line, yeah, but it was the middle of it would have been in the middle of the highway. It didn't seem like a great place to live.
You write that one rule of negotiation that you discovered is that parties can come to a reciprocally beneficial solution, but for completely different reasons. And if you're looking at the conflict right now in the Middle East, could this apply? Is there any situation that you could envision where both of these parties could be satisfied for different reasons?
Well, I could envision it, but I don't think they can envision it. In other words, right now, there's so much violence and it's going so far. It's going to take exhaustion probably to end the conflict. And that's going to take a long, long time, in my view. I wish that weren't so, but that's just a fact of what's going on. The best time to prevent conflict is before it gets violent. It's preventive stuff works much better than trying to stop a war. Nobody drops their Kalashnikov because they've listened to a groovy radio program or TV program.
Right.
Once you get into that stage, forget it, almost. I mean, one needs to try, one needs to look for ways, but it's almost impossible. It's very difficult. And it's not where we were able to do our best work.
Going back to that idea of having a go-to metaphor, yours around the U.S. Soviets was two people are in a room full of gasoline and they each have a bunch of matches. And your hope was that instead of asking them to get rid of their matches, it was to drain the gasoline from the room.
That's exactly right. But it was more the mix of matches is what they were arguing about. Who had the most and what was the more dangerous? And was this weapon system more dangerous than that weapon system? And how do you prevent it? And we saw that, well, that's important. I'm not arguing that it wasn't important, that by draining the gasoline in the room, you could shift the context of the conflict. And that's what actually happened in the end with Gorbachev and Reagan. The nuclear weapons remain. They still remain today. And we're getting back into this with Ukraine because they're threats for the first time. But what happened is it wasn't changing or removing the weapons that did it. It was changing the state of relations, the context in which the two sides were interacting.
So in a world that is beginning to be swamped with gasoline, drawing on your 40 years of experience making peace, how in the world can we drain this world of some of its gasoline?
Well, if I had the answer to that one, I'd get the Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, I think you can keep trying, and I keep trying, and I have an optimistic view of the world that it still is moving in positive directions. But unfortunately, it's like a roller coaster. There are lots of ups and downs. It's not moving in a straight line, but that things have changed and things are getting better, and that will continue to happen. But that's me as an optimist. You don't found an organization called Search for Common Ground if you're not an optimist.
You write about the need for chutzpah. Why is that crucial?
You need to be a risk taker, probably. You need to have the audacity to think you could actually even do it. I had a very large vision, and either the craziness or the audacity or the chutzpah to move forward and go with it. I'm taking a certain risk in the process, but that idea of moving forward when you had that kind of vision was something that really was driving me. And the idea is starting out that we could do something to prevent nuclear war. In other words, save the world was enough for me in the beginning. That doesn't drive me so much anymore, but maybe with the Russian-Ukraine war going on, that will become, again, a driving motivation.
John, talk to me about working with your wife, Susan Collin Marks.
I met her in South Africa when I went down there to make a television series. It took us about 24 hours to fall in love with each other. And we waited 9 months to get married because we're prudent people. But, the deal was struck about 24 hours in. And about 72 hours in, she declared to me that we would work together. And that freaked me out for at least another 24 hours until I internalized that particular idea. And we've worked together now for 30 years. And she brings to it more of a heart-centered approach, whereas my approach is a bit more cerebral. And we both can do the other sides. And I'm not bereft of a heart, and she's very good intellectually and conceptually and everything else. But our combination was much stronger. And our combination was stronger than the whole of the parts.
I know Susan, and I interviewed her for Voices of Esalen when the show was just getting off the ground. So I have nothing but absolute adoration for her. She's a great person. It's really cool that you, as a husband and wife team, have been able to work together successfully. I just love that.
Well, it gave us something to talk about incessantly. And that was not a small thing. And you haven't lived till your spouse has woken you up at 3:00 in the morning to talk about a problem in Burundi or something like that. And thankfully, it only happened a few times in our lives. But it gave us something in common that for us was quite beneficial. Not every couple can do it, but we did it, I think, very well. And it really helped in the success of the organization. The organization, before I met Susan, was more or less going on an even way in terms of budget. And after I met Susan, she came to work with us. We started to grow at 20% a year. And that continued for the next 20 years or so. And it wasn't a coincidence.
John, when you think about Esalen as potentially being an agent of positive change in the world and peace in the world, first of all, do you think that is possible in terms of what goes on at Esalen?
Oh, look, I had some of the major epiphanies in my life at Esalen. I found it was a place where new knowledge could come in to my head and my heart almost better than any other place in the world. As I said, being at the big house was where I got some of my best ideas. I think sometimes Esalen might be over into its own stuff and not so much into the outside world, but I think it is a real place to play, and I am a great supporter.
John Marks, you are the author of From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. It will be released from Columbia University Press. And John, it's just been fantastic to speak with you about the work that you've done in your incredible career.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme was composed by Nico Holloman. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. I'll be answering listener questions in some subsequent episodes, so if you have a question or a comment, please email me, sam.stern@esalen.org. Until next time, be well.